Hello, I'm Ryan Chadwick.
And I'm Tessa Koskovich. Welcome back to the Live Daily News Show.
Today, we're talking fireworks, changes for Shannon Access Clinic, and a new restaurant taking over on South Chadbourne.
Plus, San Angelo Live's own Joe Hyde, publisher of San Angelo Live, sat down with celebrity historian Raffi Andonian, who is emceeing the city's biggest 4th of July event.
But first, let's hear these messages from Jim Bass and Carpet Tech.
The 25 Ford F-150, proudly made in Kansas City. Experience American innovation with unbeatable employee pricing. And Jim Bass Ford's offering this powerhouse for just $4.99 per month. Choose from various trim levels and vibrant colors to find your perfect fit. Built in America and sold right here at Jim Bass Ford for over 60 years. Houston Hard at Arden Road or 24/7 at bassbunch.com.
My name is Cade Simmons. I'm the site manager here in San Angelo. What matters to our customers, I believe, is what we say is CT quality, CT experience, just making sure their needs are met, taking care of their home like it was ours. You just have to keep thinking of, it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. So just making sure you're taking care of what needs to be taken care of, and just knowing that they can rely on us, I think, matters to them a lot.
Well, hello, welcome to the show. I'm Joe Hyde, publisher of San Angelo Live. I'm joined today with Raffi Andonian, who is a celebrity historian. And the reason why we have him on our show today is because on July 3rd, that's going to be tomorrow, if you're watching this on July 2nd. If not, if you're watching on July 4th, that was yesterday. Anyway, we have invited you to come MC the annual July 3rd A Star-Spangled Banner Concert and Fireworks. And it's a big show. It's going to be at the River Stage. Admission's free. If you're a first responder, firefighter, police officer, or veteran, active duty or retired, you can get free seating down in the VIP area because we have a lot of generous sponsors who sponsored our tables and also our cabanas on the backside. But this, I'm just going to give you a little bit of rundown. This is the largest fireworks show west of I-35. I mean, it's a $91,000 show. It's going to be shot off the Oak Street Bridge and Celebration Bridge behind the River Stage, starting about 9:35 or so when it gets dark. We have the San Angelo Community Band that will be playing the 1812 Overture from the River Stage when it happens. We have lots of video walls set up out there. Like I said, the entire River Stage, except for the floor where the VIP stuff is free and open to the public, just like the traditional Pops concert. They always call this the Pops concert. But I invited Raffi last year, and he showed up as George Washington. I didn't even recognize you. But before we get started, you're a celebrity historian. How in the heck did you get? You're from St. Louis. How did you get into this celebrity historian, I guess, job, career?
Well, I wrote a couple of books on history, and one of the books I wrote was on how to approach contested historic sites, and I used the atomic bomb site in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where I used to work, as a case study.
Okay.
And that book got me on television in 2020 when all this stuff was going on about historic monuments and the controversies around it. So I got on television talking about how to approach these contested areas with questions.
So what was contested about the atomic bomb site?
Well, what was contested
First of all, where is it?
In Los Alamos, New Mexico.
Okay.
And that's where the Manhattan Project was. If you remember the Oppenheimer movie that came out a couple summers ago, that's what it portrays, right? Through the lens of Robert Oppenheimer, who's the chief scientist.
And so this is in 1943, 44, 45, when they're creating the atomic bombs. That we dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
To end World War II.
Exactly.
And so the reason that was controversial is because in about maybe 15 years ago, there was an effort to create a national park to the Manhattan Project site where the atomic bomb was created. And in Congress, there was a couple of reasons that some people opposed it, one of which was it was considered glorifying the atomic bomb by creating a national park to it by some people. As a result, it actually initially failed as a bill to become a national park. Eventually it passed, but that question happened when I was working in Los Alamos at the History Museum there, discussing exactly this kind of history. And so it made me kind of wonder and kind of walk down that path of, well, how do you approach these sites? How do you approach these sites that have these, different perspectives? And I came up with a kind of a blueprint of 4 questions. And those 4 questions, years later, in 2020, came in handy again.
What are the 4 questions?
Monument stuff. Okay, number 1 is why remember? So
Okay.
it's a question about significance. Number 2 is what is a history to be remembered? So you establish sort of the series of events and facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then number 3 is what does it mean to remember? And yet there you look at the nature of how something is being presented and how it's being remembered. And so what does it mean to do that? Is it glorifying, condemning, celebratory? You got to look at sort of the message behind it. And finally, how to remember, which is how you tell the stories of these places that do have many different layers behind them. I find that some of the contested places are actually some of the richest places to be able to tell these stories because there are so many layers. And I think it's our obligation, for example, because I used to work for the National Park Service at Gettysburg at the battlefield,
Right.
it's our obligation when we're at a historic
So
site.
just to let everyone know, Gettysburg was the battle in 1863 in the
Yes.
Civil War.
The most famous battle of the American Civil War.
And then they say, I always think Vicksburg was probably the turning point of the Civil War, but a lot of people say Gettysburg, where Robert E. Lee, untethered himself from Northern Virginia and went up into Pennsylvania and kind of got beat and had to retreat, was the turning point. But maybe both of them had the same significance. But that's interesting that you worked at Gettysburg, and I can imagine that during the 2020 riots and everything, when they were trying to, the Southern Poverty Law Center, whatever's trying to get rid of all these Confederate monuments and things, I would imagine Gettysburg was at the top of some of the lists.
Gettysburg complex because on a National Park Service site, so it's a little harder to go and take down monuments.
Right.
But having worked there, I knew how to handle different perspectives that came to the battlefield. And I guess my point is that I feel like it's our obligation when we're custodians of a site, whether it's National Park Service or a nonprofit entity, to be able to engage with people of all walks of life with different perspectives. Because when I was in the public service, for example, this is your park too, whoever that person is, as the public. So it had nothing to do with what I agree or disagree with. You try to suspend that and try to tell these stories, that have many different layers connected to the person in front of you. And that's what that how to remember, that last question of those 4 questions.
Okay,
is
so the how to
such a big
remember
deal.
part.
Yeah.
What is the most controversial thing that you can remember from Gettysburg?
Confederate battle flag. It's
Okay.
not anymore. I would say the tide has kind of, socially speaking, if I'm making an observation, has kind of turned where you're not going to find the Confederate battle flag as mainstream anymore. An example of that I would give is about 10 years ago, the South Carolina State House took down the Confederate battle
Right.
flag. When that happened, that's a big symbol in South Carolina, the first state to secede in the Civil War and the home of the first shots of the American Civil War.
Fort Sumter.
Fort Sumter, exactly. But I think that at the time that I was working there, which was prior to about a decade ago when that shift happened, we're talking the late 2000s, that was definitely still a hot topic. And I did a program on the Confederate battle flag, and it's, again, back to this perspective things, it's many different uses. It was used in many different ways, some positive, some negative, some just, having a totally different meaning than its original
But the
pop culture thing.
that
was the most controversial.
They call it the Stars and Bars, right?
Yeah.
That's the Confederate battles flag. It's probably the most iconic Confederate flag.
It is. It is.
And
I will say
state of
it's named the Stars and Bars. This actual
really?
Stars and Bars is the first national flag of the Confederacy. However, in common rhetoric, you're right. When people say Stars and Bars, they're probably thinking of the Confederate flag that
Yeah.
we traditionally think of the battle flag. But
Well, for
technically
example,
that's incorrect.
Mississippi took it off their flag. They replaced
That's right.
it.
That's another
They
example.
replaced it with a
Yeah.
flower, with a magnolia.
Yeah. So that's what I mean is that I think in recent years it's less controversial because I think it's one of those things where a vast majority have shifted enough that I don't think it's a debate anymore in a social context. That's just me making an observation. It's not necessarily how I'm saying it should be or shouldn't be. I'm just observing the culture, I think. But
It's been diminished.
It's been diminished.
Right.
And I think that prior to that though, when we're talking in the 90s and 2000s, it was definitely a hot topic, and you see that in flag flaps all over the place, in Georgia, in Mississippi, all over the place. But that's also when you start to see some shifts. Like for example, you don't see it flying at Ole Miss football games anymore.
Right. The rebels.
That's right. But to answer your question, I'm a celebrity historian. So when I got on TV talking about contested sites, approaching it with a series of questions in 2020, and applying that same framework from Los Alamos to these other places. That's how I first got on media. And once I got on media, I just kept going with different topics and different things. And that's how the celebrity history.
And then eventually, you actually put together like tour packages.
I do.
So
Yeah,
you could go with you
That's right.
to a historic site in America,
Yep.
and you will kind of bring in other
That's right.
historians and
That's
people
right.
to give them
That's right.
context of what's
yeah,
going
it's
on.
called Beyond the Postcard Tours, and if you want to check it out, it's beyondthepostcardtours.com.
Okay.
And you're correct. I have 16 or 17 different tour menu options there, and the nice thing is they're private for each party, so the person picks a topic they want. And the date they want, of course, had to be available. So it's designed with your interest in mind, your availability in mind, and then we custom craft the itinerary within that topic for the person's interest. Whether it's a business group that wants a leadership emphasis, or somebody maybe has a certain geographic emphasis, whatever
Right.
the case is, and their interests, they really want more battlefields or more historic homes or whatever it is. And yes, the reason I call it Beyond the Postcards is because I have a vast network, having worked and lived all over the country in history, as well as doing media work, etc., where I can bring behind-the-scenes access to many of these sites.
What is an interesting tour you do like that? Give me an interesting.
One of my favorites is called Defining the American Dream. And
Okay.
Defining American Dream, we go from the site of the Star-Spangled Banner, Fort McHenry, speaking of,
Yeah.
Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. We then go to Gettysburg, the battlefield we just talked about. We go to Antietam, there's also a battlefield. We go to Harper's Ferry, where John Brown's raid was, and there's
Right.
other significant events there as well, right at the confluence of rivers. Thomas Jefferson was there. And then from there, we go to Annapolis, Maryland, where you have the Naval Academy, and you also have two of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. There's actually 4 signers of the Declaration of Independence that come from Annapolis, but 2 of them are open to the public, and one is actually by appointment, but and the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence comes from Annapolis. And the reason I put those pieces together is because those are all issues that define the American dream, whether it's after the Battle of Antietam, when Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation to
Okay.
add slavery, ending slavery as the end of the Civil War, to the Declaration of Independence, where we declare our ideals, to a Catholic signer signing, which was religious freedom, that whole part of the American dream, the religious freedom to be able to practice the religion that you want, to the Star-Spangled Banner, where we, of course, the national anthem, where literally under a 24-hour bombardment, that song was consecrated and the flag was raised. And I would say more than any event in American history, that really, gave the American flag its sacred meaning, is that event. To this day, I don't know if you realize, when there is a new state added to the Union, the first place that the new flag with the additional star flies is Fort McHenry.
Okay.
So that's what's happened even the past century. That's how important Fort McHenry is to this day. And funny enough, at Fort McHenry, a generation after the Star-Spangled Banner was created, Abraham Lincoln imprisoned local Maryland political opposition because he was afraid of Maryland seceding from the Union. So he suspended the writ of habeas corpus as something that's a conversation today too.
Right.
But of course, it's a constitutional question and something we talk about a lot. And my point there is, those are all ways that we define the American dream, from the national anthem to constitutional rights to religious freedom to slavery. And of course, Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address, talking about a new birth of freedom, right? And so that's an example of how I take pieces that are not related from the War of 1812, the Civil War, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, put them together in a theme, a storyline, and then we get special accents.
And the storyline, the theme is the American
Dream. So what are you going to come away with after going to these sites together to understand better how we define the American dream in these different ways, and the places it was worked out, literally on battlefields, literally at these places where these events took place. And one of the really cool things I do about it is, for example, when I was at Gettysburg recently as part of that tour, we toured around with the former CEO of the Gettysburg Foundation and the former director of the National Civil War Museum. That's the kind of access you get that's not publicly available when you're with me. So you have me and my energy and all that, but you also,
you have context.
To that context.
You have a Rolodex.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have Rolodex anymore. It's on your iPhone.
That's right. It's on my iPhone. Now, the thing about the celebrity historian that I want to mention is, part of what it leads to is events like what we did last year, what we're doing here.
Right.
And part of the reason I think it's so cool is because I get to celebrate these different anniversaries. And I want to say one that's on actually the event day on July 3rd, tomorrow. It is actually the 250th anniversary of George Washington taking command of the Continental Army. We're doing it on that day tomorrow. I don't know if you realize that.
I didn't know that.
Starting this year for the next 8 years.
So he took command the day before the Declaration of Independence.
No, the Declaration of Independence is next year in 1776. So
this is a year prior.
1775, right? Because remember, it's 2025 right now,
Got you.
obviously.
Yeah.
So starting now in 1775 through 1783, which means for us it's 2025 through 2033. For the next 8 years, we're going to have a series of 250th anniversaries of the American Revolution. And remember, the first shots of the American Revolution are fired in 1775. We haven't declared independence yet until 1776. And in those first shots, in the early couple of battles, George Washington is first appointed commander-in-chief in June of 1775, and he finally assumes command on July 3rd of 1775. Doesn't know yet that almost exactly 1 year later, they're going to be declaring independence. Initial hostilities are taking place as loyal British subjects. They're not initially declaring independence. We have to remember that. That's why the revolution predates the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
So
Well, the Declaration
anniversary.
The Declaration of Independence. I was reading something about the John Hancock is the most iconic signature on the Declaration of Independence. He was a really rich guy. I mean, he gave up. I mean, he was into import-export business with England, and he made a fortune. And he had one of the nicest house in New York. Right?
Absolutely. And actually, funny, we're talking about Hancock because that signature, you also see on the George Washington commission that he got from Congress, he's the huge same signature.
Oh, really?
You see on the Declaration of Independence. You can pull it up if you go to archives.gov, which is the National Archives website.
Right.
You can pull that up and see that. It's so cool.
But the thing that got me thinking is, like, here's a guy that's worth, today he'd be Jeff Bezos, right? He'd be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He's probably worth $3 million or something, but back then, but $3 million today is $300 million, right? He was worth a lot of money. The risk that he took by putting his name on that, and of course everyone else, and there were people on there that were probably richer than he was. I mean, the money that they gave up. And I remember there's one guy who was kind of
money, their lives,
their lives, yes. Well, money in their lives, in their families, everything. I mean, you think about they put their names out there and said, "Hey, we're done."
Absolutely. And you know what's interesting about that is there's a moment when Jefferson, for example, is nearly captured at his property by the British soldiers. I mean, there are these moments where it comes very close, and you have to imagine that if they were captured, very bad things would happen to them. So it's like they say, they pledge their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor. That's what they put in the Declaration. That's what they're pledging, and that's what they're putting at risk. And it's really important. I think we look back in hindsight and we think we kind of take it for granted, and we kind of say, well, of course it was going to happen. You have to understand at the time in the world, it was so radically different to react against a king, not just that king, not just King George,
but a powerful one,
a king.
They're powerful.
See, Tom Paine in early 1776, he published Common Sense,
right?
And I often point out, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. The population back then is only a little more than 2 million. Don't forget that you could read it aloud, so it's spreading all over the place. I compared it to a viral Instagram post. By the way, I looked up the Guinness Book of World Records for the most viral Instagram post. It's by Lionel Messi when they won the World Cup.
Oh, really?
And
okay.
I calculated proportionally, population-wise, that viral Instagram post with 75 million likes would need to get at least triple the likes in order to be as popular as Common Sense was. That gives you an idea of how Common Sense from Tom Paine set the world on fire. And one of the things that Common Sense says in very plain language, which you can also pull up online, just Google it and find various universities published the entire thing. It's only 46 pages. And on there it says that one honest man is worth more than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. That's his language. And so that's not just against this King George III and his particular
It's against
policies.
all monarchies.
It's against all monarchies.
Yeah.
That is a massive step. And he sees it as we have a moment in history that we never had before to say to the whole world that not only do we not like this king, but we don't like kings at all. And you think about how much that changed world history. For the last 250 years,
right,
we have had all kinds of countries do similar movements, whether it's the European revolutions in the 19th century, whether it's the mid-20th century for much of the rest of the world.
All right, so compare and contrast. I want to get a little controversial now. Compare and contrast.
Don't forget, speaking of controversial, we had no King's protest. You ain't having a no
That's
King's
what I mean.
protest
A no King's protest
without Tom Paine writing that in 1776.
But think about that. Yeah, but think about that. The no King's protest. It almost seems nihilistic compared to what Thomas Paine was trying to do back in the 1770s. What the heck? I mean, they're all trying to find this this thing to make themselves feel good, I think, today in modern protests, and usually it's the left-wing people, you know. I mean, you had the Tea Party, but it's usually left. But even the Tea Party was nihilistic, I think. What I mean, it didn't really have a meaning. You know, for example, I'll just critique the Tea Party, okay? When the Tea Party started back in 2009, I was at the Dallas Morning News, so I was in the middle of it, you know, because a lot of it was in Dallas, the suburbs of Dallas. And you would go to those things, and you'd have, I mean, who's who of all the people that Bill Buckley kicked out of the conservative movement there. The John Birch Society, the Lyndon LaRouchers. You had all the weirdos. You know, they all showed up again. And the problem I saw with the Tea Party is it didn't have, I think, a religious or Judeo-Christian worldview as an underpinning or foundation, which is something that Thomas Paine had. They gave him the strength to do that. I mean, I think all of the founders, even though in modern history that you hear that they're all deists or whatever, but they still believed in God, even if they were
a creator.
Yes,
Yeah.
they believed in something higher than themselves. I mean, I don't think these people in the Tea Party believed anything higher than themselves. Now, there's individuals, but the movement as a whole didn't have that underpinning. You know, when you compare it to the conservative movement in America in the 1950s, 60s, the Goldwater, when Goldwater made his big speech in 1964, that was founded or based on the Judeo-Christian worldview, which, you know, assumed that we all agree that there are certain absolutes that are true, you know, and that allows us to have the freedom. And we don't have that with the leftist protests and also the Tea Party.
Let me give you some historic context for that, which I think you're saying. So, for example, if you read one of the kings of the Enlightenment, he's not actually a king, but one of the most influential, I should say, one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, which is what's influencing the founding fathers that you're talking about. And you're right, they have.
Who was it?
It was Descartes. Descartes is the French philosopher, and if you read, if you everyone's heard of this, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
That comes from Descartes.
Right.
And if you read Descartes' writing in that, one of the things I was shocked to find out, I read it in high school and not for school. I was just interested and I picked it up and I read it. And one of the things I was surprised to find out is that he arrives to the conclusion of I think, therefore I am, in a way actually understanding some sort of a creator. It may not be the sort of Christian God,
not the biblical God,
not necessarily. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that some Enlightenment people didn't, and doesn't mean that some founding fathers didn't. Like John Adams was very Christian, for example, as were many people from Massachusetts.
Right.
You're kind of different than what we think about today, because you're talking about the Puritans in New England. They were definitely the most Christian religious folks, I would say, in the United States at the time, much more so than Virginia.
Right. They were the drinkers.
That's right. They're the drinkers, and they're Anglican, which is a little bit different. But my point is that he arrives to that conclusion of I think, therefore I am, as a statement of consciousness. And because I think, therefore I am, that consciousness is representing some divine being. That's how he would explain that.
I don't agree with that.
Hang on. Well,
I'll let you make your argument, but I don't agree with that.
Here's what I'm saying simply, is that even in Enlightenment, which is known as the Age of Reason,
right,
there is a foundational belief that there is some larger creator, some larger absolute.
I think, therefore I am, is a very inward statement, meaning that mankind is the decider of everything.
Well, the way he gets there when he's making that case is he says he's basically stripping apart all the things that can deceive us with our senses.
Okay.
And so he says, how do you know what is? And the only way you know what is you think, and therefore you are. That's all you have. So that's a very Enlightenment thing to say.
So it's not a ends. These are not the ends. This is the means.
Correct.
The means to get to where the truth is.
Correct. He's trying to uncover some deeper truth.
Right.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay. I can agree with that.
A lot of the Enlightenment guys, they were trying to. There's a couple of things that they're doing. One is understand. They think of God as the clockmaker. That's what a deist is, right? And now you think of. How is this clock actually operating? That's why they're so interested in science.
Right.
And that's why they're so interested in doing a lot of observations. Jefferson did this. George Wythe, his tutor, did this.
Benjamin Franklin.
At home. Benjamin Franklin, of course. They're just curious, right? They're trying to learn this huge, vast, beautiful world that has a creator, see how it works. So in some ways, science and God can actually go together. This was an example in which they did. And then the other thing that they're trying to do is trying to say what's an illusion and what's not. And you do have some guys, for example, shortly after Descartes, You have a guy, his name is Hume, his last name is a philosopher. He says, I can't trust anything through the senses. How do I get through the senses? So these are all kinds of things that they're talking about. This is happening in Scotland, in England, in France,
Right.
and it influences the founders, of course.
Right.
And so to your point, the whole fundamental belief of believing in innate human rights, which is what they're talking about in the Declaration of Independence, right? As they talk about rights endowed by their Creator. Natural rights is the term.
And divine providence.
So
in there,
how do you have natural rights? It means that this is not something that any government can give you. You're born with it. Well, how can you believe that you're born with it unless you believe in something greater, right? So it is based on that. One other thing that's interesting is how it applies to religious freedom. If you look at religious freedom, which they would call religious toleration, is what they would call it, certainly early on. John Locke writes an essay on religious toleration. He's one of the most influential philosophers on Jefferson. Now, he predates Jefferson. He's dead by the time Jefferson comes around, but he's still influential.
Right.
And the more famous piece that we think of with John Locke is Second Treatise of Government, in which he defines what natural rights are. And a lot of our government, including the Declaration of Independence, has language that comes from that.
Yeah.
But the other piece,
they call it natural law.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But the other piece that is, and it's, by the way, incredible to read John Locke. It's an incredible intellectual exercise. The Second Treatise of Government. But the other piece that's less known is his essay on religious toleration. He's writing this in like the 1680s, 1690s. And what he says is this idea of liberty of conscience that we're all born with. By the way, that liberty of conscience, in a way, kind of sounds a little bit like Descartes' later, I think, therefore I am. It's like this conscience, this focus on consciousness. And the reason he talks about that liberty of conscience in the context of religious freedom is he says two things. One is, I have a direct connection with God. That's a very Protestant way of thinking, by the way. You think about Martin Luther, Protestant, a century and a half prior.
Your personal relationship with Jesus.
God. That's why you read the Bible directly, right?
Right.
That's why Protestants cared about learning, reading, and writing. Catholic Church, to this day, you don't have Bibles in the church because it's more focused on the institution. So just different philosophies, different approaches, right? And so that in it is kind of baked in, this notion of liberty of conscience. I read the Bible and I have my conscience and my connection to God. That's not a very Catholic way of thinking. That's a Protestant way of thinking. John Locke is building on that. And then he says part two, the reason liberty of conscience matters is because if I were to force you into my church against your liberty of conscience, I've actually polluted my church because you're not a true believer. You're just going through the motions so I don't chop your head off.
Right.
So it's actually purifying my church for me to not have you in there, and for you, with your own liberty of conscience, to come over if you choose to, or you don't, so that you're actually a true contributing member.
So Raffi, you're talking about these really deep meaning of life kind of
think about
questions.
Evangelicals later in the Great Awakening in the mid-18th century.
Well, they had a Great Awakening in like 1722 also.
Exactly. Yep.
It seems like these Great Awakenings always
There's
predate,
a couple versions.
they always predate something really big happening in our country.
But the
There's-
evangelical movement, just real quick, is based on having a conversion over that is authentic, right? Because you have to actually believe and convert, born again, whatever the case is, rather than me chopping your head off or threatening to chop your head off or your joint. So these ideas build on each other, but all of that is to say, if I have that liberty of conscience, there's a certain notion of freedom that's based in there, which then influences our political rights and our notion in the revolution.
Okay, so we're talking about deep meanings of life, the meaning of life, why I am who I am. These kinds of questions are what forms nations.
Exactly.
Right? Today, No King's Protest,
back
or
to that.
this rapper who, he said, hey, kill the IDF or whatever on the stage. I mean, we have some terrible cultural icons out there that are yapping about, crazy stuff. And my theory is, and tell me if I'm right, you're pulling up French philosophers. Jean-Paul Sartre, he came up with the idea that if you see an old woman trying to cross the street, you can either push her into the traffic and kill her or help her across the street. It doesn't matter. It is just the fact that you can do it. And that's existentialism, basically. And so I argue that these modern No King's protests, things like that, are basically, they're just doing something to get notoriety. Their purpose is to get notoriety for themselves, not to really change the world for the better.
I think that's, I think, yes, I think that's generally true. I think that...
And it's on the conservative side, too.
Sure.
I mean, you see a lot of grifters on X that are doing the same thing. They're just trying to get everyone has a beacon, their media company. They're all trying to get they're all trying to get hits, and they blame me of that. But I don't care. But
the only thing that I would say, just the little caveat to that, although I hear you, is remember that they have to get attention in order to actually have an influence. But the question that we have to ask is, do you stop at getting attention, or when you get attention, are you translating that to something material?
Well, the mayor,
And I think to your point,
the mayoral
they don't often
candidate
translate it to something material. They're just getting attention. That's what you're saying.
But
which I
maybe
think is often the case.
Maybe the mayoral candidate for New York's mayor, the communist or Democrat, what do you call himself? The Democrat, communist, or socialist? I mean, that guy, he's going to take away property rights.
Yeah,
I mean, and that's what he wants to do. I mean, so he actually is going to. I mean, he may follow through with some of these crazy cockamamie ideas.
Yeah, the only trick with that is, I have two minds of that. I mean, look, my dad escaped from communism, so I certainly don't like that stuff. But I also think, if that's what the people of New York City want, then I get their political right to vote that in.
Right.
And then of course they're going to have to deal with what happens after that.
Mm-hmm.
But I have my opinion, but he's also not my mayor, right? I'm outside of New York City. I live in St. Louis, so I think that the part that it pertains to us as people that are not in New York City is that going to influence where the National Democratic Party goes? Because then that does matter, because of course then it kind of becomes a more national thing, in which case I think that we would probably vote against that as a nation. New York City might have it as a mayor. You're going to have these random things pop up across cities.
Well, New York City is our largest city.
It is our largest city, but it's also not reflective of the entire nation.
But it will be. I
You
mean,
think so?
yes, I think it will start a trend. Just like back in the 80s, anything that happened in California spread east, right?
Well, I understand what
Property
you're saying.
tax reform, all the kinds of crazy stuff came out of California.
It just doesn't seem to me that,
Windmills,
Missouri,
they
Kansas,
started,
and Texas are
the
gonna
windmills started in California, and now they're all over Texas. Anyway.
But I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, in the overall picture, maybe there's elements that might come out of
Right.
it. I see what you're saying. There might be pieces that come out of it, but I have a hard time imagining that would be exactly like
But
this.
a lot of it is that, and I believe this happened. I believe our young, like the kids, the people who are my kids' age are saddled with student loan debt.
Sure.
They gave them big promises that hey, you go to college, you'll get a good job, you'll have a good career, and now they're saddled with so much debt they can't even buy a house.
Sure.
And so if that were me, and I was around a whole bunch of people in the same boat, I'd say, well, screw this capitalism. Let's try communism.
I think that's part of what you're seeing happen. Yes, I think, in my opinion, the solution to that is to have broader prosperity, right? To make sure that everyone has access to prosperity, rather than centrally controlled, government-assigned things like you're talking about with the socialist or borderline communist stuff.
Right.
Because I think that leads to problems in supplies, and I feel like you see that around the world in communist countries. There's always shortages of things because you don't have the flexibility of prices.
You're a historian. Remember, that, Ken Burns, his best work. Ken Burns.
Civil War.
No,
You don't think so?
Vietnam.
Okay.
Vietnam. And Civil War is good. It's really, really good. I made my kids
Some
watch
might
it.
say national parks. I have people that say that too.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
There's a national park one.
but I think the Vietnam War, because it impacted everybody. It impacted but imagine if we had a draft ongoing right now, and a Vietnam War situation going on. I don't think we could hold the damn country together.
Well, to your point, going back to the No Kings, I think that we have more freedom than ever before. And ironically, I feel like we complain more. And I think that sometimes what we don't see is that we have such a privilege, that we're so privileged that we can complain about the privilege and make big deals out of small things. When you look across, back in history as well as around the world, some of the stuff that we freak out over in context is really, molehills, not mountains.
Right.
And I think that actually, ironically, in the name of screaming oppression and No Kings, actually reveals how much privilege you have. Because it shows that you can think that it's a huge deal to freak out over this little issue when there is much larger issues around the world that people are suffering.
And the other piece of it is, without the framework of the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence that influenced it, they would have no voice to be able to go out there and protest. They'd be killed.
If you want to look in a more macro perspective, exactly, is that, you look at nations' foundations across time, more macro than even what I went. This is the only place that you can have that level of freedom to be able to do that, and we are the ones who started that. Any other countries that have versions of that, and I would argue they're not quite like us.
Right.
Any other countries that have versions of that, they're actually inspired by our example. So we're still at the original, creation of that. And sometimes you might say, well, some countries in Europe. Well, you know what? Most of Europe, they still had kings and queens.
Yeah.
You want to talk about no kings?
And they also have generations and generations and generations of wealth.
Talking about generational wealth, clearer social strata, I would say. That
And you're on rung 3 of the ladder. You're not going to move.
Exactly. So so I would say that I go back to, there's of course some levels of freedom in Europe, but I would say that any level of freedom they got is copying the United States, and is not to the extent that we have. So I think that, again, it reveals the privilege that we have. Now, if you step outside of Europe and look across much of the world, it reveals even more privilege that you have. And I feel like sometimes we put our problems next to the problems of other people around the world. They would look at us like we're being spoiled brats and what we're complaining about.
All right. On the same note, when I was in the military, I was in the Air Force, and I flew the Pacific West. I mean, Guam, Thailand, South Korea, Australia, and Diego Garcia, those areas. That was kind of my area of responsibility. And one of the things that really impacted me, and this is really a roundabout way of mentioning this, is the whole situation in Cambodia with Pol Pot. And if you imagine if America wasn't here, how many Pol Pots would be massacring, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, just to get rid of the non-believers, so to speak, the ones that don't believe in the regime, or the ones that are not part of the good old boy network. We always talk about the good old boy network in San Angelo. Can you imagine if this was, Pol Pot's good old boy network, and you're not in that network, or you're educated, you're gone. And the only thing that keeps that from happening wholesale in the world is America.
Yeah, and this is the thing, is that you spoke about you as a veteran, and I realized that it's okay to disagree, and I love that we have I would say disagreement has been since the beginning of the United States. I mean, even the founding fathers disagreed on many things.
Right.
That's why the Constitution is a series of compromises.
The Federalist Papers. I mean, an argument. It was argument in public.
For it. Yeah, exactly. So why is there a series of compromises from the very foundation of our country? Because there's always been disagreement. However, when we disagree, I hear you in that. I think where I have a challenge is when we act like the core idea of the country is rotten. That's where I have a problem. We can disagree on policy, whether you like the president or don't like the president, or you like certain pieces of legislation or don't like certain pieces of legislation, or whether you like the mayor or don't like the mayor. I love having that kind of conversation. That's great. Where it's a challenge, I think, is when we sort of, we go so over the top in acting like we're oppressed by a king, or we're oppressed by Hitler, or we're oppressed by whatever the case is.
You have that on both sides too. You have the right declaring the deep state.
That's right.
Anything they disagree with in the bureaucracy is part of the deep state, and they're evil, and they eat pizza at some pizza restaurant, and they're into kids. And then on the other side, you have the communists, basically, who just want to tear everything down.
On both extremes, no doubt. There was a little bit of that, if you think about it, against Obama too, right? Is that whatever you think of Obama and his policies, there's a little bit of, he's like Hitler when he does this, and I think we go too far when we say those kinds of things. And so, I remember, John McCain, for example, he said, he thinks that when they were campaigning, of course, he had honest disagreements with Obama, but that does not mean he's Hitler, right? It's too far. So I think that, part of what the United States stands for is disagreement. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind the privilege that we have, so that we're not disagreeing in a way that everything is the end of the world type of discussion. That's where it gets very challenging, it gets very shrill, and it makes it so we can't have a conversation.
And also it could destroy our country. And we know what happens if our country goes on.
If you push that too far and it becomes an existential crisis, of course, it can absolutely tear it apart. Yeah.
Well,
Raffi, it is
Raffi,
pretty remarkable. Just one quick, but it is pretty remarkable that we've made it 250 years. You'd be hard pressed to find a republic that has.
That's right, especially with all this freedom,
That's right.
But anyway, tomorrow is the July 3rd concert and fireworks. It's called a Star-Spangled Banner Concert and Fireworks, largest fireworks show west of I-35. Everything's being launched off of the Celebration Bridge, Oak Street Bridge, free to go down there anywhere downtown, or you can come into the river stage. We're allowing coolers this year. Awesome thing. Just don't bring any bottles, okay? We don't need glass bottles in your coolers. If you want some, if you're a first responder or a military veteran, you can get down on the VIP floor. If you're a rich guy and want to help us pay for some of those tables and all that, please contact me or Downtown San Angelo Inc. We have a trolley, so parking to get downtown is going to be a lot easier this year. You can park at the San Angelo Civic Center, which is there on Rio Concho Drive. That's where the City Council meets. It's a gigantic parking lot there. You can park there, and there's a trolley. They'll drive you anywhere downtown, and of course to the river stage. Fireworks will be going off about 9:30, and I have Raffi Andonian here. He is going to be the MC of the river stage show, and as you can tell right now, he is very steeped in history.
I am. And, you know, in celebration, I want to say real quick, we're talking about the Star-Spangled Banner event. One of my favorite moments last year from the event when I was emceeing was hearing the Star-Spangled Banner just as the fireworks were going to go off. That was really cool to hear.
Yeah.
And that's why I wore my pin here. That's from Fort McHenry, where the Star-Spangled Banner was created in honor of that here today.
All right. And he is, help me out, celebrity historian?
Yeah, celebrityhistorian.com is where you find a link tree where all kinds of stuff. You'll find a link to the tour there, or you can look up the tours directly at beyondthepostcardtours.com. There's a whole menu there and a way to inquire if you like.
And he'll be at the ArcLight Bar and Grill after the fireworks.
Of course I will.
So if you want to meet, come meet him
let's
in person.
Chat over a beer, philosophy, history, whatever the case is. Yep, let's do it.
But anyway, Raffi, thank you for coming on our show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Back to you guys.
Man, what a great interview.
And you know, Joe, they're always going to be long, and it's going to be a full-on conversation, right? Topping the news today, the countdown is on for San Angelo's biggest Independence Day celebration. The Star-Spangled Banner Concert and fireworks is set for tomorrow night at the River Stage. Festivities kick off at 7 p.m. with live music from San Angelo's own 12 Mile Band, followed by the San Angelo Community Band, and what organizers promise will be West Texas's largest fireworks show. A free trolley will shuttle visitors between downtown spots and parking lots throughout the evening.
To add to that, I'm pretty sure what Joe said was that we will also be seeing shuttles go from bar to bar.
Oh,
so
I mean, that's interesting.
There's no need to drink and drive downtown.
Yeah. Be safe.
In health news, Shannon Medical Center has announced the Shannon Access Clinic will move to a new location starting next week. Beginning July 7th, the clinic will open at 2626 North Bryant Boulevard, replacing its longtime spot on East Beauregard Avenue. Clinic hours will stay the same from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m.
And food lovers have something new on the horizon. A restaurant called First Bite is planning to open soon at 1724 South Chadbourne Street, taking over the space formerly occupied by Tacos Locos. The new spot will feature burgers and bacon-wrapped hot dogs and promises a whole new flavor experience. No official opening date has been announced yet. Remember, more information on all these stories is always available on our website.
We'll be right back with all of your holiday weekend forecast after this message from Jay Chandler.
It's hard to believe how reckless some people can be and how hard they fight against real victims. You need a partner who consistently beats the giants and who will never, ever flinch.
Now let's talk about the weather, because it could have a big impact on tomorrow night's fireworks show and your holiday weekend plans. Today, showers and thunderstorms are likely throughout the afternoon and evening, with steady temperatures around 77 degrees. Rain chances are at 60%, and some storms could bring heavy downpours and gusty winds up to 20 miles per hour.
Tonight, the rain continues with a 50% chance of showers and thunderstorms, and lows will drop to around 71. Tomorrow, July the 3rd, showers and thunderstorms remain in the forecast, especially between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. Then the chance of rain jumps to 70% with a high near 84 degrees. Winds will stay coming from the south-southeast at 5 to 10 miles an hour, but could jump up to 20 miles an hour.
For Independence Day on Friday, rain chances drop slightly to around 40% in the afternoon, with partly sunny skies and a high of 88. Storms could still pop up in the afternoon, so keep an eye on that radar, as they could affect your weekend plans.
The good news is that by the weekend, we're expecting drier and sunnier conditions. Saturday and Sunday will both be mostly sunny with highs near 94 and south winds around 5 to 10 miles an hour.
The National Weather Service has also issued a slight risk for flooding tomorrow, meaning localized flooding could occur if heavier rain develops. So remember, never drive through flooded roads.
If you're making plans for the holiday or heading to the river stage, definitely check out sanangelolive.com for current weather updates. Now here's a word from our friends at Kano's Diamonds and Coins.
When it comes to unique pieces you can't find anywhere else, Kano's Diamonds and Coins is your one-stop shop. With over 24 years in the diamond and coin industry, Kano's Diamonds and Coins is West Texas's choice for diamonds, jewelry, coins, silver, and gold. Owner Bill Kano stands by his work and offers free consultations, including estate jewelry. Don't just trust anyone with your valuables. Come see the staff at Kano's at 1016 West Beauregard in San Angelo.
Well, that's it for today's edition of the Live Daily News.
For updates on these stories and coverage of tomorrow night's fireworks show, visit us anytime at sanangelolive.com.
We'll see you back here on Monday. Stay safe and dry, San Angelo.
Have a good weekend.